Welcome to this car seat. Today we are talking about stakeholder engagement, a topic which we discussed during the recent meeting of our regulators forum. And to discuss these ideas about stakeholder engagement with me, we have Andrea Mennicken here, who is Deputy Director of CARR, as also is at the Department of Accounting here at LSE. Andrea, why is there this interest in stakeholder engagement in the contemporary literature and among regulators?
I think what's useful is to distinguish between different types of interests. So what interests are we talking about and interests of whom? And I think if we take average people, people like you and me on the one hand, if we take the people for whom regulation is made, for example, patient safety regulation and the patients themselves, but then also advocacy groups, patient interest groups, I think they're interested in stakeholder engagement as they would see it as a way of democratizing regulation, increasing participation, giving patients and others who are regulated a voice. Then if we look at the regulated parties, I think here there might be an interest in widening participation and stakeholder engagement so that they have their say, and it's not necessarily only about lobbying, that is part of it, but it's also about providing input into the design of regulation and sharing expertise. And then I think one other group we shouldn't forget are the regulators themselves. And the regulators are also stakeholders. They become stakeholders when we look at multi-level regulation, when we look at transnational regulatory settings. And then they actually enter the scene as having a stake in how international, transnational EU regulation is designed. And here widening participation and stakeholder engagement means something very different than if we're talking about stakeholder engagement at the level of patient safety or regulating doctors, regulation of prisons or industry or certain industry sectors, chemical industry.
I mean, stakeholder engagement sounds a lot like consultation and all these kind of old stuff. And there's been a lot of criticism about consultation in the past, that people are sort of only talking to the select few, that the membership is fossilized. So what would you say, reflecting on our meeting, the problems with engaging with stakeholders, others, in meaningful ways?
Yeah, I think I would say that some of these issues are still, of course, present today. And you could also definitely ask that question, is stakeholder engagement anything more than consultation? Is it more than just listening to the parties you regulate and having then maybe too close relationships with them? And I think that also came out in the meeting we had, that it's not necessarily clear what engagement means, because engagement can take on very different notions, from just seeking contact with regulated parties, but also consumer groups, other public interest groups for information. So the regulators actually want to sound out how they would react to certain regulatory proposals. They want to collect information. And that's, of course, different from engagement, where you would think about engagement in terms of a dialogue and active input, agenda setting, not by the regulators or parliament topics, but also from the ground, bottom up. And I think this is not really clear what it means, and it has become coined as this broad notion. And I think it continues to be interpreted really differently. And in the regulators forum we had, it turned out to be the case that there was a wide variety of views what it meant and who the regulators see as their most important stakeholders.
And within that variety, there were sort of a number of ways regulators talked about how they engaged. Can one even talk about sort of the key principles they established or shared about what it means to engage well? Again,
I think first what's important is to distinguish between organized forms of engagement and whether you have a formally organized process of stakeholder engagement. An example would be at the level of standard setting, also international standard setting, if you think about the ISO standards, but also accounting standards, where you actually have a due process, and that due process requires stakeholder consultation, stakeholder engagement. But then, of course, we have a lot of more informal ways of organizing engagement. And I think in the forum, that is very important and shouldn't be underestimated how important that is to gain support for your regulations, for your new proposals. And I think that was also one important theme that was brought up consistently in the Regulators Forum, was that it's important for the regulators to gain legitimacy and support for the activities they do, and that is not just about reputation management, it's also about making regulation work, because you want to have regulated parties on board, for example, and you want to also design regulation that's meaningful, and you want to have input here, not just from the regulated parties, but also from those who the regulation is for. How effectively or not you then organize this form of engagement is a tricky thing, because there is no one best solution to do it, and a lot of it depends also what you want the engagement for, whether it's to gain broad support. So here technology becomes very important. Can you actually involve the broad public, for example? On the other hand, if you want to have more targeted input, what was made clear was by the regulators that were in the Regulators Forum, that what's often more important is quality input rather than huge numbers of different parties sitting around a table when you may not even be able to forge a consensus, but to get then actually high quality feedback, for example, on some proposals, that is really valued, and this is where they want to then sound out both the regulated parties but also the other stakeholders.
People get quite excited about digital technologies, new social media, ideas about crowdsourcing and so on. We have the red tape challenge in the UK. Was there any form of enthusiasm, you think, for these new digital forms?
I think what was interesting that there is a shared view that these technologies are important. I would say the level of enthusiasm varies across regulators, and some have experimented with crowdsourcing, for example. For example, if you want to involve the public more broadly, crowdsourcing can be useful if you want to collect views. But I think they also still make use of more traditional forms of technology. And crowdsourcing, there might be a new technology, but it still then also goes back to the more old forms of technology use, opinion polls, for example. And regulators still use that also to get an idea about the public views, for example. What I thought was really interesting is that certain new technologies like Twitter or social media, regulators didn't find as useful. Twitter, for example, was described as a one-way communication, and what for them is important about stakeholder engagement would be a two-way communication, where also the regulators then can not just spread what they're doing, but that they can also seek feedback, and that you actually engage in a dialogue or debate, discussion. And certain technologies allow for that and others don't. So I thought that is interesting, that we need to then think about what technologies we're talking about. But there's clearly an interest in that, but more experimentation currently, I would say.
Andrea, thank you very much.
Thank you.